Ashwood was a town forgotten by time, a dark jewel hidden among shadowy hills and dense forests. The sun rarely lit its streets, and an eternal fog seemed to embrace the town, making everyone who lived there feel trapped in a never-ending nightmare. However, there was one place that drew more fear than any other: the ancient cemetery known as the MidnightCemetery. The townspeople whispered stories about the cemetery, each more terrifying than the last. But one story stood out, a legend that spread like wildfire among the residents. It was a tale of a supernatural phenomenon that began to engulf Ashwood on a night in October, when the wind howled like a lament and the full moon illuminated the weathered gravestones marked by centuries of despair. On that fateful night, echoes of whispering voices began to drift through the deserted streets. The fog, thicker than ever, enveloped the town, bringing with a sense of dread and hopelessness. The townsfolk, terrified, locked their doors and windows, praying for the night to end soon. The first victims of the phenomenon were found the next morning. The cemetery caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, was discovered in a horrifying state, his eyes wide open as if he had seen hell itself. Beside him lay strange markings on the ground, forming a pattern that pulsed with malevolent energy. The local police, called to investigate, began to experience inexplicable events. Lights flickered, equipment malfunctioned, and in a moment of sheer terror, one of the officers, young Officer Parker, swore he saw a spectral figure beside a gravestone. When he approached, the figure vanished, leaving only a trail of cold and shadows. The residents of Ashwood were in despair. Some, unable to bear the growing sense of terror, decided to abandon the town. Those who remained banded together, forming a bond of fear and distrust, praying for protection against the horrors unfolding in the shadows. It was then that a young woman named Emily, marked by the loss of her brother, decided it was time to act. With a brave heart and fierce determination, she gathered a group of townspeople to investigate the origins of the terrifying events. Armed with lanterns, cameras, and audio recorders, they ventured into the cemetery, certain that the truth awaited them among the gravestones. As they explored the site, an oppressive sensation enveloped them. The temperature plummeted and the fog thickened, as if it were attempting to swallow them whole. Suddenly, the recorders began to pick up whispering voices and macabre laughter echoing among the graves. The group froze in fear, but Emily's courage encouraged them to press on. They reached a crypt that seemed to pulsate with life of its own, and upon entering, they found an ancient diary covered in dust and spiderwebs. The diary belonged to Jonathan Blackwood, an occultist who had lived in Ashwood a century earlier. As Emily read the yellowed pages, Blackwood's story unfolded before them. He had performed dark rituals in the cemetery, seeking supernatural power, and in his quest, he had unleashed a curse that would imprison his soul and many others in an eternal prison of darkness. With the revelation of the curse, Emily and her group realized they needed to undo what Jonathan had done. Reciting the incantations from the diary, they attempted to free the trapped spirits and restore peace to Ashwood. But as they uttered the words, the crypt began to tremble, and a spectral figure appeared before them. It was Jonathan Blackwood, his expression twisted by a mix of rage and despair. "You cannot stop me," he shouted, a supernatural force emanating from his being. The group struggled to complete the ritual, but Jonathan unleashed a shadowy attack, enveloping them in a shroud of terror. Emily, her heart racing, continued to recite the incantations, determined to end the curse. The fight intensified. Blackwood seemed to feed off the fear radiating from the group, and with each word they spoke, he grew stronger. But at the climax of the battle, with a final desperate verse, Jonathan let out a horrific scream and vanished in a burst of light, The cemetery was enveloped in a wave of energy, and the malevolent spirits were released from their prison. The fog dissipated, and a soothing calm settled over Ashwood. However, Jonathan Blackwood's freedom did not mean the end of terror. He was merely biding his time for the right moment to exact his revenge. The townspeople, relieved for a moment, soon realized that the darkness had transformed into something even more sinister. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and whispers echoed through the streets, calling for lost souls. Years passed, and on a fateful day, a new caretaker was hired to tend to the cemetery. Henry, an elderly and weary man, possessed deep knowledge of the secrets surrounding the MidnightCemetery. But one night, while inspecting the gravestones, he heard a sound coming from Jonathan Blackwood's crypt. Curious and cautious, Henry decided to investigate. Upon entering, he found an ancient mirror covered in dust. When he looked into the reflection, he was shocked to see Jonathan Blackwood staring back at him. Before he could react, a spectral hand emerged from the mirror, grabbing Henry and pulling him inside. The mirror shone brightly, and in an instant, Henry disappeared, leaving Jonathan free once more, bringing with him a legion of malevolent spirits. The nights in Ashwood became a true nightmare. Residents reported terrifying apparitions and inexplicable events. Panic spread like wildfire, and the town, once full of life, was consumed by desolation. In desperation, the townspeople turned to a renowned paranormal investigator, Dr. Adrian Graves, known for his abilities to deal with the supernatural. Upon arriving in Ashwood, Dr. Graves found the town engulfed in absolute terror. The darkness seemed alive, and a sense of despair hung over every corner. He gathered a new group of brave residents, including Emily, who still remembered the previous battle. Preparing for a final confrontation, the group armed themselves with amulets and silver weapons, advancing toward Blackwood's crypt. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and a chilling fog surrounded the cemetery, obscuring their view. When they reached the crypt, a horde of malevolent spirits surged forth, attacking them with relentless fury. The battle was fierce. Dr. Graves led the group, reciting incantations as they fought against the shadows. Emily, determined to end the curse, moved toward the mirror, knowing it was a key to imprisoning Jonathan once more. With a scream that echoed through the crypt, she held the mirror high and began reciting the words from Blackwood's diary. The malevolent spirits, sensing Emily's intent, began to thrash about, their cries reverberating among the gravestones. Jonathan Blackwood, now angrier than ever, appeared before her, his spectral form twisted by rage. "You cannot stop me, girl. You have no idea who you are dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Emily replied, her voice firm and filled with determination. "You have brought pain and suffering to this town. It is time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The light from a mirror began to shine intensely, reflecting Jonathan's image back at him. The crypt shook, and a wave of energy began to sweep through the space. Jonathan screamed in agony as the light enveloped him, but his fury only seemed to grow. "No, I cannot be trapped again," he shouted, writhing in torment. With one last scream, Jonathan lunged to attack, but it was too late. The light from a mirror exploded in a wave of energy, and Jonathan Blackwood was pulled back, his form disappearing in a whirlwind of shadows. The malevolent spirits accompanying him began to dissipate. Finally freed from his influence, the cabin where the battle took place fell silent, and the light slowly faded. The group, exhausted yet victorious, gathered around Emily. "We did it," Henry said, looking at the friends who had fought alongside him. "Finally, Ashwood is free. But victory did not last. With the curse broken, a new darkness began to take shape. Residents started reporting strange dreams, visions of dancing shadows, and whispers calling their names. Something had stirred in the depths of the cemetery, and the town began to feel the weight of a new terror. Dr. Graves and Emily, realizing the fight was not over, decided to investigate further. They discovered that Jonathan Blackwood's curse was merely a layer of a much deeper evil. The town was tied to an ancient cult that had performed sacrifices in search of power, and Jonathan's spirit was just one of many that haunted the cemetery. The nights in Ashwood turned into a true hell. Whispers echoed through the streets, and the presence of evil was felt everywhere. The group began to investigate the ancient rituals that had been performed in the town, seeking clues on how to defeat the new threat. During their research, they stumbled upon an ancient crypt hidden beneath the cemetery, housing the remains of one of the cult's victims. As they descended, they were met with a biting cold and a darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. The walls of the crypt were covered in esoteric symbols, pulsating with malevolent energy. While exploring, the shadows began to stir, and suddenly, a voice whispered from the depths of the darkness, "You should not have come here. That which has been sealed must remain sealed." The tension rose, and without warning, spectral figures began to emerge, surrounding the group. Each shadow seemed to have a face, expressions of despair and pain. The battle that ensued was brutal. Dr. Graves and Emily fought valiantly, but the shadows were numerous and relentless. At the climax of the battle, a shadowy figure stepped forward. It was an ancient entity, thirsty for souls and power. "You thought you could destroy Jonathan? He was merely a pawn in my game. Now, you will pay for what you've done." In a desperate act, Emily remembered Jonathan's diary and began to recite the words he had written, trying to invoke a light that could dispel the darkness. The shadows hesitated, but the entity remained firm. "Those words will have no effect on me," it screamed. But Emily refused to give up. With a cry of determination, she threw herself in front of the entity, holding the mirror that had captured Jonathan. "Take this," she shouted, raising the mirror to the shadow. The light began to shine, and the entity screamed in despair. The battle culminated in an explosion of light and darkness. The entity, surrounded by the light of the mirror, writhed and screamed while the shadows began to dissipate. With one final effort, Emily pronounced the final words, and the entity was sucked into mirror, its fury transforming into a distant echo. When the light finally faded, the group stood in silence, breathless and exhausted. They had won, but they knew the fight against evil would never truly end. Ashwood was free, but darkness would always lurk in the shadows, waiting for a new opportunity to strike. The Midnight Cemetery, now a symbol of resilience and courage, still bore the scars of the battles fought. The whispers of shadows would never cease to haunt the town, but Emily, Dr. Graves, and the residents of Ashwood were determined to protect their home, ready to face any darkness that dared to threaten them again. Thus, the story of Ashwood continued, an endless cycle of light and darkness, of courage and fear. The echoes of the past would never be forgotten, and the legends of the Midnight Cemetery would continue to be told, a warning for all who dare to enter its depths.